Welcome back. More businesses are engaging in community relations to foster social partnerships and generally contribute to the community quality of life. But there are still issues with regards how community relations is practiced. Joining me to talk about some of these issues is Dr. Austin Tam George, Executive Director, Institute of Communication and Corporate Studies, Lagos, and an expert in communication and stakeholder management. Good morning to you, Doctor. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with looking at some of the issues in community relations practice. Why are there issues?
Oh, well, you see, first of all, it is very important for businesses to recognize that they are located in human communities and they serve human interests. So there is always this kind of symbiosis, this kind of symbiotic relationship between business organizations and communities. So how they forge that relationship in a way that makes business successful, in a way that sees the communities as partners in progress, is what community relations is all about. So basically what it deals with is how to make sure that businesses interface with communities in a way that will conduce to a better business environment.
So apart from the business environment, that also contributes to how the books will run, because when there's a good relationship between the businesses and the community, then there's less cases of violence, vandalism of company infrastructure and the rest of it, which automatically translates to affecting the profit of the company most times.
That's correct. What happens is, as soon as communities understand they are not just receiving business presence, but they are actually partners in the business operations of these organizations. The tendency is for the businesses to say, look, once we are dealing effectively with these communities, engaging them, not alienating them, because it's always this sense of alienation that generates the frustration to say, look, we are here, you may have the legal license from government to operate, but you need the social license of these communities in order to actually operate on the ground. So the kind of synergy that you create between business organizations and communities is what community relations is all about. And what we've seen over the past 50 years in Nigeria is that, there has been stories of, those who succeed in engaging with these communities and those that have not quite succeeded. And the picture is a mixed one, but that is changing gradually, because more and more companies are realizing that things they could get away with over the past 50 years, they can't quite get away with them in 2015. So there is a changing dynamic of community relations practice in Nigeria presently.
Let's talk about that changing dynamic, because it's always been about the extractive industry, the oil and gas companies that operate, especially in the Niger Delta region. There's been constant, residents and communities being disgruntled about how, these companies relate with them, engage with them, in terms of what it is that you can offer us and what it is that we're supposed to be doing with you.
You see, it's good that you mentioned the extractive economy, because what we've seen over the past 50 years or so in the Niger Delta communities, where you have thousands of communities that, are rich in oil and gas, is that there has been a historical grievance the communities hold against some of these major oil companies. And now we are beginning to see even more and more indigenous investors in the sector. And so what we've seen is that there is this historical grievance. How can we get the communities participate in this process as stakeholders in the extractive economy? So what we've seen is that more and more companies are recognizing that they need to interface directly and honestly and dispassionately with these communities in order to integrate them into their business decision-making processes. We've seen an example very recently, I think 1 month ago or so, of the Grand Bonnet community, that has had an MOU with some of the oil majors, including Shell and LNG. And what we've seen has been a very significant model where there has been no violence, there has been no altercations. We see a very enlightened community leadership dealing with very honest corporate leadership and producing a memorandum of understanding that is likely to last for 25 years. Now, this is a very major departure in the sense that, it departs from the traditional, brickbat, between companies and these communities where you have constant tussles and frustrations. Now there seems to be a recognition that, look, the best way to go is to actually deal with these communities as honestly and dispassionately as possible and integrate them as part of a business strategy in dealing with business issues in these communities. And so what we've seen in the particular example of Bonny is that the people have recognized that, look, we can in fact be stakeholders. The businesses integrate them into the strategy of engaging with them, and then they realize that, look, the best thing we can do is to say, these are the ways the communities can drive their own progress, and then the companies will support them. So the dynamic is changing.
But then it now also looks as if, you know, this community relations practice hasn't had as much success as you would like it to have had.
Yeah.
You know, because we're looking at just a region now, the Niger Delta region. What about translating it now to national development? You're talking about core practice of community relations,
yes,
because we are a larger community, whether we like it or not.
Yes. You know, we've seen violence in some communities, not only in the Niger Delta, by the way, because there's a tendency to always characterize communities in the Niger Delta as turbulent or restive. But we've seen, for instance, in Ekpe area in Lagos, you know, where those who were in charge of transforming the community, you know, have been gunned down. Some fellow was gunned down just 3 weeks or so ago by unknown gunmen. Investigations into the criminal activity are on, but there's a suspicion that the communities are not very happy with developments happening in the area. So the point you raised about the prospect of violence characterizing those kind of relationships is very real. And this is why I keep going back to the example of Bonny, because it seems to present itself as a model. If you can honestly and respectfully engage with traditional hierarchies of authority, if you can deal with youths, if you can understand the demographic aspects of community engagement, the tendency is that you will not see your relationship with communities as an episodic encounter.
Which also means that these businesses don't do proper homework before they venture into those communities. They just feel that you have to keep handing out piecemeals to them. They don't believe that, okay, apart from working with us as partners, you can also be part of the value chain of whatever it is that we're doing here in your community. Yes,
and the best model then is to make sure that the community is seen as the drivers of their own progress. Because the moment you characterize the relationship as a giver and taker relationship, the tendency is that there's a hole that you can never fill in terms of constantly giving, because the demands will keep changing. But the dynamic that we are seeing, you know, in the Niger Delta region especially, is that the communities are now emerging as drivers of their own progress, drivers of the process of their own development. So what I think is going to happen going forward is that companies will increasingly recognize that they need to engage with these communities, identify, you know, legitimate structures of power. Because what we've seen is, you know, we've seen more and more people emerging as centers of power and influence within communities, militants, activists, all kinds of people. But if you can correctly identify those that occupy, you know, traditional structures of power, it becomes easier and more legitimate a process to drive in terms of engaging these communities. But I think that the problem over the past decades has always been to try to divide, you know, communities that appear not to always buy into company processes. You know, try to divide them in order to conquer them. But now you see that more and more enlightened communities are emerging. In fact, dealing with the Bonny community, I was surprised that some of the traditional rulers were actually PhD holders, some of them former government officials. So the tendency is that, you know, businesses need to understand that these communities have very enlightened leadership, and it is possible to engage with them.
Yeah, so in engaging with them now and moving away to the larger picture of engaging on a national level, do you think there are realistic models that can be implemented?
Yes, I think so. The realistic model is actually the traditional model, meaning recognizing that these communities are stakeholders, recognizing that these communities have a say in the way businesses thrive in their localities, recognizing that the communities themselves play a very key role in environmental stewardship. For instance, we recognize that once businesses begin to function, they will generate some kind of environmental impact, and there is no way you can mitigate that successfully except the communities themselves participate in the process of environmental stewardship. So my sense is that even from a corporate strategy point of view, communities have a very significant role to play, not just in the Niger Delta, but across the country. And the earlier businesses integrate communities as part of their corporate strategy, I think the better the relationship will be.
Okay, so but you've been part of some of this corporate strategies, so to speak.
Yes.
What lessons have you learned from, you know, being part of it?
What I've learned is that a lot of these multinational companies, when they come, say from Europe or from the US, the tendency is for them to have some kind of cultural illiteracy, if you like. They are not really culturally sensitive. They don't really understand that they may be coming into communities that live sometimes in almost primitive conditions, but these communities have a very dignified sense of who they are. So what I think they need to do going forward is have cultural sensitivity training. So understand that, look, when we are dealing with these communities, there are a great deal of cultural issues that might come into play when we are relating with them. So what they need to do is to make sure that there is greater cultural awareness, a greater involvement in cultural strategy, and making sure that the communities themselves understand the kind of work they do.
But then you see, they will argue with you there, because as much as they're coming from, there are multinational companies coming in, they have indigenous, partners as well who work with them. So one would expect that these indigenous partners should better explain to them the kind of community that they're coming into, that they should understand that there's a hierarchy that you need to be speaking to, and there's leadership process, and you need to get this all tidied up before you begin to, operate in the environment there.
Yes, but the truth is, your point is accurate, but the truth is, no two communities and community relations are the same, because there are specificities. In fact, that's one of the fundamental differences between community relations and public relations. In public relations, you're dealing with a very vast, heterogeneous public, but in community relations, there's a certain specificity in dealing with specific communities. So no two communities have the same expectations, they don't have the same hierarchies of authority, they don't even have the same modalities of engagement. So there is a great deal of specificity that comes into strategy when you're dealing with these communities, which is why I think that it is always wise for organizations like Chevron, organizations like Shell, organizations like Halliburton, and increasingly indigenous organizations like Seplat and the rest of them, to understand that they need to have very elaborately specified community relation strategy to make sure that no two communities receive exactly the same treatment. Because once you flatten your responses to community demands, the tendency is that communities will say, look, we are not like that community. These are our own specific expectations. And so you have to find a way to specifically relate to these demands. Not all of these demands will be met, I have to say, but there has to be no alternative to engagement, constant, regular, respectful interface between these companies and the communities that serve their businesses.
Dr. Austin Tam George, thank you so much for coming on the program and sharing your perspectives with us.
Thanks for having me.
Our Business Morning continues in just a moment. Join us again.